Assalamu alaikum, my dear participants, to this session of Islam Study Circle. We will begin right now, and the sequence of our study is the same as we generally adopt, and that is that we first take a look at some Quranic verses, then a hadith is discussed, and finally we discuss some biblical verses. So let me start off by discussing the Quranic verses. These are basically 80, verse number 14 to 17 of 87th surah, which is called Surah A'la. And the title that I have given these verses is Spiritual Enhancement or Spiritual Advancement. So the words are قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى وَذَكَرَ اسْمَ رَبِّهِ فَصَلَّى بَلْ تُؤْثِرُونَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى. In the hereafter, successful shall be he who purified his soul and remembered his Lord's name, then prayed. No, in fact, you give preference to this worldly life, even though the life to come is better and more lasting. So clearly you can see that these Quranic verses spell out the fact that success in the hereafter is dependent on how we purify our soul. And if you allow me to say, the purpose of divine religions is just one, and that is spiritual enhancement, spiritual advancement. And in the terms of the Quran, in the terminology of the Quran, it is called tazkiyah. So tazkiyah is something which is the purpose, which is the objective of religion. And all the directives of religion, when we follow them, the result is that we should become purified individuals. I have discussed this several times before, that the Islam, as far as religion is concerned, was the same delivered by all the prophets of God. They delivered the same religion, barring some slight differences in the Sharia as far as the primary contents of religion are concerned, which of course are al-hikmah, which of course signify faith and morality. They have been the same, consistently the same in all divine religions, starting from Adam to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All of them have presented the same imaniyats, the same articles of faith, and the same tenets of morality. So we need to understand this, that their purpose has always been to purify souls. And we know that the reason for this is that, or the Almighty has said, that paradise is a place for purified individuals. Paradise is a place in which only those people will enter who have purified and cleansed their souls, and they are spiritually advanced. And so therefore, the objective of religion today and the objective of religion has always been the same, and that is to purify human souls, to purify their undertakings. And we need to understand that, as I was just adumbrating earlier on, that the precepts of religion vis-a-vis the tenets of faith are concerned, they can be divided into various branches and various concepts. For example, faith in the hereafter, or belief in the hereafter, belief in God, belief in the prophets, belief in the books of God, belief in the angels. So these are all beliefs. Similarly, we have the precepts of morality. And morality, of course, is something which is ingrained in human nature. We don't need to ask any person outside ourselves as to what morality is. So the purpose of morality, the purpose of faith, all these articles of faith, as well as the Sharia which is given to us, is to purify ourselves, to purify our individual and collective lives. So we have directives from the Almighty which purify our individual lives, and we have directives from the Almighty which purify our collective lives. So in our collective lives, of course, we mean the collective system. For example, people who rule Muslim countries, people who rule a state, they are given directives in their capacity as rulers, so that when they implement those directives, or when they adopt those directives, to be more precise, the collective life or the collective system of that country becomes purified, it becomes spiritually enhanced, it becomes beneficial for not only the individual people who live in it, but also the collectivity as a whole. And as you can see here, a particular verse of the Quran has been highlighted here. It says, "Qad aflaha man tazakka wa zakara asma rabbih fasalla." Successful shall be he who has purified his soul and remembered his Lord's name and then prayed. So, first of all, it needs to be understood when the Quran often says that you remember the Almighty, and the word it often uses is zikra or zikr or tazkira. These are some of the common words which the Quran uses to remember the Almighty. Remembrance of the Almighty, of course, here relates to remembering His practices, remembering His sunan as the Quran calls them, remembering His attributes. So it would be erroneous to construe from this verse that it is basically a mention of God's name. So it's not like that, because of course God's name has an attribute associated to it. So when we remember God, our purpose is to remember some of His attributes, and as a result, those attributes remind us of how the Almighty deals with us and how He comes into interaction with humanity. So when it says وَذَكَرَ اسْمَ رَبِّهِ فَصَلَّى, it does not merely mean to take God's name. It actually means to take God's name in a cogent way, in a meaningful way. Thus, for example, when we say Alhamdulillah or other words like Astaghfirullah, or Inshallah, all these words are actually words which make us remember the Almighty at various instances of our routines and our lives. And then you see the verse says Fasalla. The person who remembers God and then he's prayed to the Almighty, who has offered prayers to the Almighty. So we need to understand that salah or prayer is a very special form of this zikr. Of course, as I said, the zikr is in general, it can encompass a lot of things. But when we talk about salah or namaz or the prayer, it is a specific form of zikr. Reading the Quran is another form of zikr, but to pray to the Almighty in the ceremonial way is the primary way to actually remember the Almighty. And this is what the Quran says is it will give us spiritual purification. When we stand before God, when we pray to Him, when we deliver and when we communicate all our miseries, all our woes, all our anxieties, and all our worries, we shed our worries when we talk out our worries to the Almighty and before the Almighty. So the verse says, "Kad aflaha man tazakka." Basically, people who succeed in the hereafter are the ones who adopt this practice of purifying themselves. And then this is one of the examples which the Quran gives, that the one way to purify oneself is to remember the Almighty and keep Him in remembrance all the time. And the primary form is to pray whenever the time of the prayer comes. However, there is this emendation at the end which says that people often forget this, people often disregard this, people often do not give due regard to this remembrance, and what they do is that they end up sacrificing very, very high ideals and very, very high rewards for meager and trivial things. And here that the Almighty says, بَلْ تُؤْصِرُونَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى, which means that instead of worrying about purifying ourselves, instead of making enough efforts and sufficient efforts to make this, to achieve this goal of spiritual enhancement and spiritual advancement, what happens is that a person ends up as a person who gives more preference to this worldly life, whereas the life of the hereafter is lasting and is better as well. وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى. It's better than the life of this world and also lasting. So the stress here is that it's not that we need to forsake the world, or we just need to leave aside the world and go into some corner or some abode and just dedicate ourselves to worshipping the Almighty. This is not what the verse is saying. It is saying that whenever there is a clash between this world and that world, people end up giving preference to this world instead of that world. And that is what hampers their spiritual advancement. That is what actually cuts down this whole exercise, and the purpose is not achieved. So in two words, the Quran has not only pointed out this fact that basically it's the spiritual advancement which is real success in the hereafter. It has also pointed out the fact that what stops us from attaining the spiritual advancement, and that is the love of this world. And not just the love of this world, it is giving preference to this world over the requirements or the precepts of the next world. So as I said, it's not that you need to forsake this world. We have been sent in this world so that we contribute through our abilities, through our various skills to the life of this world, the society. But at the same time, what we need to understand is that forsaking this world is not what the Almighty has said. The requirement of religion is that whenever there is a clash between this worldly interest and that worldly interest, a believer should end up giving preference to that worldly interests. And that is why this Quranic verse makes it ample clear that we have to guard ourselves. We have to be very, very specific in this regard. We must not go astray. We have to keep this focus. And finally, viewers, we need to understand this also, that tazkiyah or spiritual advancement or spiritual purification is not an independent activity or an independent act, so that we have to indulge in certain exercises or certain routines so that that tazkiyah has to be attained. If you study the Quran, it becomes evident that by following religion as a whole, by adhering to religion as a whole, and by following the directives that religion has given us, tazkiyah is the byproduct, is the consequence of this adherence. So we don't need to do anything separately to attain that tazkiyah. The Quran wants us to follow what religion tells us. The Quran wants us to adhere to the precepts of religion vis-a-vis morality, vis-a-vis faith, vis-a-vis Sharia or of this divine law. And when we do so, the result is that we become purified individuals. And as I said earlier on, the reason that the Quran stresses this so much is that it is only these purified individuals who will enter paradise in the hereafter. And hence it is essential that we do realize that it is of paramount importance that whenever we follow a precept of religion, whenever we follow a directive of religion, we must understand the objective. And the objective of every single directive, whether it's the prayer, whether it's the fast, as far as individual directives are concerned, or whether it's, for example, the fact that our collective system should be based on consultation, this is a collective directive. So whichever directive you pick up, the purpose is that that directive either purifies or sets right our individual life or our collective life. And once that is done, we become eligible for the kingdom of paradise that awaits us, and that of course is the desire and of all of us, and we do covet it. So viewers, we now go on to the next part of our study circle, and that is the hadith that we're going to study today. And this hadith has been taken from the Al-Jami' al-Sahih of Imam Muslim, and the words are, An Abi Hurayrata anna Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam qal, Rubba ash'asa madfu'in bil abwab law aqsama ala Allahi la abarrahu. Abu Huraira reported that God's messenger said, many a person with disheveled hair and laden with dust who are turned away from the doors are such that if they swear by God, God will fulfill their oaths. So what this hadith is trying to convey to us, or what its words are communicating to us, is the fact that don't go on the appearance of people. At times you see a person who is absolutely ridden, who appears to be disheveled, who is dust laden, who doesn't have proper clothes, and you just dismiss that person as if he is a non-entity. Whereas the fact is that he could have such a coveted position before the Almighty that whenever he prays or whenever he makes a supplication, the Almighty does not dismiss it. He even fulfills that oath or that of that supplication. So don't always go after appearance. Appearance can be misleading. We often judge people by how they look. This is the cardinal mistake. It's a very common mistake, and it's a cardinal mistake that most of us are guilty of. The appearance of a person is never to be taken into account while judging the character of that person, unless we have had enough exposure to the character of that person by dealing with him or her in certain ways. We just cannot make a value judgment. And even when we have had this interaction with the person, even then it's difficult to pass a judgment, because at times we do not have the complete data. And the data which we will never have, in fact, is the data which relates to our hearts. We don't know how the person is from his inside. What we are doing is we are evaluating that person by his appearance, by his looks. So I do often see that men of course, who wear the beard, who keep the beard, they at times think that they are superior to people who do not have the beard. And similarly, women who wear the hijab, they think that they are superior because of this appearance, that they think they are following the appearance that the Almighty has directed them to wear. They think that they are more superior than women who do not wear the hijab. I think this judgment should never be passed. What a person is from inside, only God knows how he is or how she is. We just cannot make a judgment by looking at the appearance of that person. Many a time a person might appear to you from outside what he is not an iota from his inside or her inside. So this would be a very wrong judgment that we do make, and we need to understand that a person is pleasing to the Almighty vis-a-vis his attitudes, vis-a-vis his character. The Quran at one place has pointed this out by saying, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that the most valuable person and the most honorable person in the eyes of the Almighty is the one who is the most God conscious, who is the most God fearing. So, and it is something which is the domain of the Almighty. Only He knows who is more closer to Him. We are no one. As far as we are concerned, our duty is to introspectively look back on our own selves. We need to understand that we must not judge people. If ever we have to judge anyone, it has to be our own selves. Because in that case, we do have a sufficient amount of data. We know who are from our inside. So the lesson that we need to learn is that we must stop judging people. Not only in their lives, we have this bad habit of judging people when they die, and we often label them that they are kafirs, or they are people who are doomed in hell. We absolutely have no authority to make this decision. This is God's domain, and when we enter God's domain, we are actually crossing our own domain and entering His domain, which of course is something which is absolutely unwarranted. We need to understand that as far as the fate of a person is concerned, this is entirely the prerogative of the Almighty to decide. We are no one to even pass a comment. As I said, if there is a lot of commotion in us, and if we have this intense desire of judging, then let that judgment be against our own selves. Let us be very stringent, very strict in judging our own selves. We should turn that telescope that we often use to pick the faults of others and find faults in others towards our own selves, and find out how we are and how we fare. Because as we know who we are, of course, this is something that really takes a lot of effort to analyze our mistakes, and that is the only data that we have that is really reliable, because we know who are from our inside. And this judging of people, or judging people by this name, is something which is so common that if you realize that most of our personal gatherings, our gossip, is related to judging people, discussing them in absentia. And of course, this goes as far as backbiting and gossiping. And of course, the sad part is that the data is based on hearsay. We don't have any knowledge of a lot of things, and we make such sweeping statements, such value judgments, that we have all the data in our own pockets. This is of course a farce, and we need to realize that we are very, very humble and weak people, and what is better off is that we concentrate more on our own selves, instead of seeing what other people do and how they fare and how they look and why they do certain things and why they don't do certain things. The best thing is that we need to review our own lives, and this is a constant activity. We just cannot let go of it. I often compare it with the dusting of a house that we do every third or fourth day, because the dust keeps settling on things, and just as we don't stop dusting our houses, we cannot stop cleansing our own selves. Because you see, just as dust settles on things around us, similarly this dust of evil does tend to settle in our hearts, and they need constant cleaning. So self-accountability and not judging people is something which is a constant effort that we need to do. We just cannot become slack in it, because if we do so, we will end up gathering a lot of evil dust in our hearts, and that, of course, will make them rusty. And as we just discussed earlier on, it will be counterproductive to the objective of tazkiyah, or purification. That is the very objective of religion. Now, viewers, let us move on to the third part of our study segment, and that is we're going to study a Bible verse of the day. This is basically, these are two verses, verses 8 and 9, and they have been taken from Proverbs, which is, of course, the book attributed to Solomon, the prophet, who was the son of David. And David himself, we know, was the one who was blessed with the book of Psalms. So father and son both being blessed with separate divine books. So as far as Solomon is concerned, we know that his book of Proverbs is something that I would advise all of those who are interested in reading the Bible, that they must read this book of Proverbs. This is called Kitab al-Amsal in Arabic, and it's called the book of all the Amsal in Urdu as well. So you'll find pithy sayings, concise statements from Prophet Solomon, which he is actually delivering to various people. And you'll find out that these very precise statements, very succinct statements, they actually assume the shape of proverbs, as if they are proverbs, because they are just one-liners or two-liners, and they just go straight into the heart. So if you do have the chance to pick up the Bible, do go through this book of Proverbs. So let me read out these verses before you. My son, give ear to the training of your father, and do not give up the teaching of your mother, for they will be a crown of grace for your head, the chain ornaments about your neck. So basically, these verses from the Prophet Solomon, they are advising children, they are advising grown-up children that they must lend an ear to their father and mother, because their father and mother are their well-wishers. I can safely say this, I think no one will dispute the fact that our mother and father are the greatest well-wishers on earth that we have. They really feel for us. They have no personal or selfish motive. They are absolutely, totally devoted to our well-being. And whenever they say even harsh words to us, the purpose is not the harsh word itself, but the purpose is the content of what they are telling us. So, as children of our parents, what we need to realize is that we must value the advice which our parents give, which our mothers and fathers give. Of course, we don't have the obligation to agree with it. We have this authority, we have this freedom to differ with the advice of our fathers and mothers, but we must give it a proper thought before dismissing it, and that too in a very polite way, in a very, very empathetic way, in which we sympathetically think of the advice, we ponder on whatever good things that they have to tell us. And of course, there are a number of things, because of their experience, because of the fact that they are senior to us in years, that they can really tell us, and it will be a big blessing to learn from their experience and to learn from how they have gone through in life. But at the same time, fathers and mothers also need to realize that when they are trying to educate their children, when they are trying to advise their children, they must not thrust their opinions on their children. They, especially the grown-up ones, what they need to do is they should present their experiences, they should present their advice in the form of various at various opportune moments, and in the form of very, very precise statements. But at the same time, let the children also be given the chance to reflect on what they have to say. So, although the advice here is from the parents to the children, but as a consequence and as a corollary, we also need to understand that parents also need to be very prudent. They also need to be very, very wise and sagacious when they are counseling their children, because in my own right, I do try to counsel children and parents, and I think that counseling, whether it's related to the parents or to the children or to the siblings or to the spouses for that matter, it's a skill. It's an art that all of us must learn, because this is something that all of us generally do go through. And I often end up seeing couples and seeing siblings and seeing parents and children in agony. And often, when the things have gone beyond control, do they come and ask for advice? So it would be much better that parental counseling and children counseling are introduced as subjects in our curriculum at this high school level, so that parents know how they should advise their children. Because you see, advice has to be given in a very professional way, in a very skillful way, in a very meaningful way, in a very effective way, in a very convincing way, so that the children are really moved. And the basic thing in giving an advice, which I often advise parents, is that they must not be over emphatic. Parents generally tend to be over emphatic. They stress a point several times. They don't get satisfied unless they have made the point about 4 or 5 or 10 times each time they see their child. And this, of course, is very irritating. So you need to understand, or we need to understand as parents, that children, they need to be given sufficient time to ponder on the advice you want to give them. And at the same time, you must also think that your child can have a different personality. Obviously, in most cases, he does or she does have a different personality. And if he or she has a different personality, then you have to accept that individual with that different personality. You cannot impose your own religious or social or cultural views on your child. You can educate them, you can communicate it to them, these views to them. You can argue very cogently and in a very polite way with them, but you just cannot have the final word in this regard. You just cannot have the final say in this regard. It is the right, I would say it's a human right which has been given by the Almighty to every grown-up child, that he has the final say in accepting an advice. But at the same time, the word of caution, or the word of I would say importance, which this particular these particular words of Prophet Solomon sound in our ears, is that as children, because grown-up children today, they dismiss parental advice in the blink of an eye. They don't even listen to what their parents have in mind. So this is an attitude changer that needs to take place, that as children, at least listening patiently to the advice, at least listening patiently and reflectively, and giving it due weight, even if you have to dismiss it, even if you have to forsake it, then that should take place in a very, very positive way, in a way in which the parents do not think that they are totally being told off, or they are being scolded, as is the case generally these days. But as I said at the other time, the flip side is that parents too need to realize that giving an advice, correcting your children, reforming them, it's a skill that they must learn. It's not just a thing which comes into their mind, and without realizing the time, without realizing the place, without realizing the situation, they just blurt out their mind or their views without any cogent and without any proper sequence, or without any regard for time and situation. So as I said, this is an art in itself, and the parents need to understand that. So viewers, with this we come to the end of this first section of our study circle. Of course, this relates to the fact that parents in our own right have this ability, or innate ability, or this persistent ability to keep on advising their children, but this needs some skill and some amount of art, I would say. And as we said earlier on, we did discuss some of the other things, especially the ones regarding the Quran, in which self-purification was highlighted. And in the Hadith, we studied that we must not judge people by their appearance. It is not the appearance which counts, it is the inner person which counts, and only the Almighty knows who we are from our inside. So let this judgment be done by the Almighty and not by us. So let's open the mics of people if you have any questions regarding this first session. So if you have any questions, kindly unmute your mic. I see Ms. Rafia Khwaja that your mic is unmuted. Madam, you can go on. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, Dr. Shehzad, two questions. One is that you explained to me that when a child is born,
right. Please go ahead.
Have we learned that the azan should be given? Is this a
Madam,
subcontinent?
right. So this is a generally believed custom amongst our people here in the subcontinent and many parts of the world. But research has shown that this was introduced much, much later. It never existed in the time of the Prophet. Even the earlier jurists of Muslims never said anything regarding it. It was much later, many centuries later, when this practice was introduced, and it was actually ascribed to the Prophet. So I would say that this is something of a newcomer or new thing which has been introduced in the practices of Islam, and this is something which is rampant. Of course, every Muslim child goes through this experience of hearing the azan and the iqama in the right and left ear, but research has shown that this has no basis in the original sources. So I can only comment this much here. If you need more details, several articles have been written on this issue, and some of our scholars at Al-Mawrid have even done research related work, so that can be read. But what I can say here is that this is something of a new thing which has been introduced, and it has become so common that people think that it existed in the time of the Prophet as well.
And my second question is regarding, you said that that it is not really right to be criticizing people, but what about criticizing our politicians? We have no right to criticize them when publicly we know that they've done a lot of wrong things.
You see, this is an exception. As far as people who hold public offices are concerned, criticism, of course, if it is directed towards them, is our right, because they are our representatives and they have actually declared that they are publicly accountable before us. So they, as far as accountability is concerned, that is something that as people who have voted them to power, we have our right. So I would not say that that comes under this. You can criticize people because of the fact that they have presented themselves for criticism, because being representatives, they would like this feedback and this critique, and this is how we can reform them as well and present our views. At times, it's not always that our view is correct. Of course, at times we don't have the complete information, and therefore our criticism is not that weighty. At other times, it lacks data. But whenever we have this effective criticism and we can deliver something to them, I think we should do so. And also, we should use means which each of us has available. For example, newspapers or social media, which has now become a very powerful instrument in communicating things to various quarters of the society. So yes, I would say that as far as people who hold public office are concerned, they can be criticized because of the fact that they are public servants, and this is how they would improve. And of course, criticism should be positive in its nature. It should be something which recommends them towards their betterment, induces them to become better public representatives, and it should not be criticism for the sake of criticism.
Thank you very much.
So I don't see any more hands being raised. So I will now continue for the next part of our study circle, and this is normally a misconception that we study regarding various precepts which go and various concepts which go under the label of Islam. So the misconception that I have selected today, in fact, relates to some of the content that we just discussed regarding parental counseling and parental guidance. So one of the areas in which parents become very, very dictatorial, I would say, is the fact that they invoke the Quran, certain verses of the Quran, and say that the Quran has given this authority to the parents that they must not be disobeyed. They have to be obeyed at all costs. And for this, they even go as far as to invoke the Quranic verse which says, فَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ وَلَا تَنْهَرْهُمَا. So the word uff is used by them, and they say that this means that the children cannot even utter a word of complaint regarding their their parents. If their parents decide that they have to marry in a particular family or a particular tribe or a particular area that they have chosen, then the children are bound to accept the view of their parents. And if their parents want their children to become doctors or engineers or artists or chartered accountants, so whatever field that father or mother selects, the child is ultimately bound to select it. I know that there has been a change in hearts in this particular scenario, but let me tell you, still in a lot of third world Muslim countries, this practice is still rampant, in which parents think that it is their right to decide how his child or her child is going to grow up, who he or she is going to marry, and what career he or she is going to adopt. So they think that this is something which is the right of the parent, and if the child argues against them, they would simply say that the Quran has said that you cannot complain against your parents because the Quran has said فَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ. And I think I have referred to this earlier on a couple of times as well, that the word uff in the word of the Quranic, in the Arabic language of the Quran, does not have the same connotation as the Urdu word uff. In Urdu, it does mean it's a word of complaint, but in Arabic, uff, it says that you must not be disrespectful towards your parents. So here the word is being disrespectful to the parents, to showing disrespect to the parents. This is absolutely, of course, all of us do understand that is unwarranted. We just should not indulge in disrespect towards our parents. But we have every right to differ with our parents politely. We have every right to present our view politely again. And we have every right to follow our own worldview and not get imposed. We must not impose our worldview on our children. We can advise them. We can communicate the good points of what we have adopted, and we can also communicate our failures to them. But as I said, we cannot impose our views on our children, especially our grown-up children. They have to be dealt as grown-up human beings. They are adults. They are as good as us. So if we force our children to do something, it will be a grave violation. And I dare say that it can be called a violation of human rights, because this is something that we have to avoid. We need to realize that the Quranic verse here, فَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ, does not mean that we cannot utter a word of complaint against our parents. It means that we should not be disrespectful to them. So the word uff here has been generally wrongly translated and cited. And also let me point this out, that not at one place in the Quran does it say that you have to obey your parents. You might be surprised to hear this, because we often cite this, that parents must be obeyed. But let me tell you categorically that there is not a single verse in the Quran which tells us we have to obey our parents. What it does say, and several verses do say this, is that we have to deal with them affectionately, kindly. So the words are وَبِالْ وَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. وَبِالْ وَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, that deal affectionately with your parents. There is not a single word which says that you have to follow the dictates of your parents. So this is another thing which might be something of a misconception that has arisen. And as I said, it might have gotten reformed in some of the societies, but in most third world Muslim countries, this is still the case. That I often call it parental hegemony. Parents, without realizing, they impose themselves on their children, and they don't realize that their children are grown up as good as their own selves. And they have this right by the Almighty to become any person that they would like to. So, of course, a father or a mother might feel very, very perturbed if their children adopt ways which are not congenial to them, which are not rightful to them. But as I said, this is something which is between that person and the Almighty. That person is a complete person. The child is now a grown-up child. What often happens is that we don't realize this, that this particular area, it does not belong to us. It belongs to a right which the Almighty has given our children. So with this misconception, I would like to open the mics of people who would like to ask this question, that if there is something regarding parental advice or relationship, that please let me know. Okay, I can see Asir Zahur. Yes, I have opened your mic. Please go ahead. Asir Zahur, Mr. Asir Zahur, please go ahead. I have opened your mic.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can barely hear you. Could you just be a little louder?
Sir, this is regarding the. Yes.
Right.
Sir, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Sir, this is. Sir, just. Yeah. Sir, just a few questions. Sir, this is the first question is regarding the verse that we discussed of Surah Allah.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, you said Bal tu usirun al hayat ad dunya. Bal you translated as no in fact.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, does it mean but or does it mean no in fact?
See, bal is always emendative. It's like
Because
istidrak.
I'm asking this because just.
Right. So bal means in fact. So in fact is something which always is an emendation on a previous thing. So when it says in fact, it actually says no in fact, which says contrary to what you think, the situation is like this. So please go ahead. Asir, I think there's some. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, just wanted to ask about the direction of address. When the Almighty says, "Bal tu usirun al hayat ad dunya," no, in fact, you prefer the life of the world. Sir, who is this you?
So the addressees here are the Quraysh, the people of Mecca who were being delivered this warning from the Almighty. This last group of the Quran, of which Surah Allah is a part, is specially directed towards the idolaters of Arabia, and of course those among them who had even converted, they had this weak faith. So they are being told that the thing which hinders their purification, or which hinders them from coming closer to Islam, in other words, is that for them this world is everything, and they give preference to this world or the interests of this world over every other thing. Yes, please go ahead.
Because the first verse, I think it is addressed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sabbi isma rabbikal ala. That should be addressed to the Holy Prophet.
Yes. Of course. You see, the direction of address changes as you see as the surah goes on.
Right. And sir, in the same surah,
right.
Sir, Allah says, "Sanukriuka fala tansa illa masha Allah." We shall recite the entire. This is the confirmation by the Almighty that don't worry, we shall recite the entire. Then it says the next verse is illa masha Allah, except which Allah wills. So has there been any part of the Quran which was revealed but is not?
Well, we do not. Of course, there could have been, but we do not know for sure. All that this verse tells us is that in the final reading, in the final compilation, the Almighty will make the Prophet read the whole of it, which, in other words, means that He will make him memorize it. And if there is a verse that needs to be abrogated, so it's like telling him that if there is a chance of something to be abrogated, it will be done so. Whether it actually took place or not is something which we don't know. So it's like saying that I'm going to do this if need be. So it's like telling the Prophet that this is how it's going to happen. Remember, this is a Meccan surah, and the final compilation of the Quran took place much later, about 10 or 12 years from the revelation of this surah. So the Prophet was being told of a future event, that don't worry, he will memorize, the God will make him memorize all this Quran, except if there is something which he deems should be left out. So it's like a potential possibility. Whether it actually took place or not, we have no knowledge of.
Please say that. Hello?
Yes. Please go ahead.
Because, sir, with regard to the verse of zina, the punishment for zina,
right.
They generally say that verse has been, the verse regarding for that punishment, stoning punishment. They said it has been that verse was abrogated.
So well, we have done
because I've heard scholars say
right.
This is where Allah says.
Right. So we have done a lot of detailed work on this particular issue, and we have shown that this is not even a verse of the Quran. It does not even deserve to be called a proper Arabic sentence, which they think was part of the Quran and was left out, if you're referring to the Rajam verse. So I would advise you to please read it at some of the instances in which we have explained it, both verbally and in the written form. And please look up the appropriate places. So you'll find out that this is, although many of our scholars do believe that this was the verse, because it has been quoted in some of the narratives by Ibn Majah, in which this verse has actually been spelled out as.
Yes.
So that is why I would like you to just look up the research article that Al-Mawrid has produced regarding the punishment of fornication and adultery.
Right, sir. Thank you.
Welcome. So nice. Yasin Fahad, madam, I'm going to open your mic. Your mic is now open. You please go on with your question.
मेरा सवाल ये है कि like what I wanted to ask was if a person has wife on one side who is demanding to live separately due to the issues she's having with her mother-in-law every day or whatever, and there is the parents on the other side, and the son, he gets two separate houses, one for his family, wife and children, and one for his parents, and he is taking care of all the expenses of the parents, and he's looking after them. But the parents think that it's not fair to them, or it's not just to them, that they have separated them in this old age, and one of the parent is a chronic patient as well, right? But the children are doing what they can, like they were living with their two sons, and then now both sons are living separate, and the parents are in a separate house, and they feel very bad about it. The parents feel very as if they have been thrown out of the house or whatever. So I'm trying to understand, were the kids right to do that? Because they have to take care of their family as well, and the things were really getting
Right.
the relations were really getting bad living together. So they came up with a solution. But then are the parent, would it be considered as not taking care of your parents or leaving them alone in their old age?
Right. I do get your question. Right. Yes, I do get your question. But you see, it's difficult to pass an absolute judgment in the case that you've referred to, because there is a lot of data that still needs to be divulged and that still needs to be known before giving an absolute verdict. But in general, in principle, I would say that as far as this particular issue is concerned, because this is the issue of every third house that we come across when there is a joint family system. If the parents are dependent on their children because of their medical situation, because of their old age, then of course it's the responsibility of the child, whether the son or the daughter, to look after them. And for this, he or she has to make the best arrangements. At times, this is only possible when the parents are living with you, because such is their nature. They're so weak, they're so frail, they're so bedridden that their care cannot be taken by assigning them to some different place. Or at times, it is possible to do this by you hire someone, you hire some maid or maybe some steward who looks after your parents. But again, you see, it all depends on the situation. The bottom line is that as children, if your parents are dependent upon you, then they are your responsibility. Now, how should one discharge this responsibility? As I said, it has various forms in various situations. There is no rule of thumb. If they are looking after their children in a way, their parents in a way that their own conscience is satisfied, I think that is the best charge. You see, this is something which is at times very difficult, because when you're working, if both the children are working and the spouses are also working and the grandchildren are also at school, at times letting them being alone in the house, and in the same house, is also difficult. But then help can be arranged as well. So instead of going into the details, because details vary from house to house, from parent to parent, from person to person, the bottom line needs to be understood, and that is that you have to emotionally satisfy your parents. If they are dependent on you, you have to look after them, you have to take care of them, and this can take various forms. At times you have to live with them, at times they have to live with you, at times you can separate them and still be able to discharge your responsibility. So there are a number of scenarios, and if this responsibility is realized that the children carry, I think these details can be worked out. And if their conscience is not satisfied, I think that is something which just points to the fact that they're just not doing enough and they should do something more. That's all I can say, because
I think the son gets really in a difficult spot because he has his wife on one side and children.
Right.
And they might say they don't want to live
right.
together
So it's indeed a very difficult situation. It's a very difficult situation, but you see, you have to come to grips with these situations, and these are situations that are common situations, and I often see that the husband takes note of these things when they become very sour. I think he has to realize this at the very onset, at the very beginning, and when things start to get out of hand, it is only then that the husband realizes what he has to do. So I think we need to understand this, and as responsible parents, transmit this information to our children as well, that if there is a responsibility at hand, then you have to face it, and we must not delay it, because at times when you delay matters, they just go out of hand. And most of the cases which I have dealt, I can see that things have been ignored and ignored and ignored until they become a bombshell and they just explode. So if things
to separate, or they don't agree to the idea of having
Right.
a separate place.
Right. So you see, if parents, they are not willing, they are not emotionally satisfied, then that is a big indicator that the children need to do something to satisfy them emotionally. Because you see, if there was something in which they could have lived independently, that would have been an entirely different thing. But if they are emotionally or medically dependent on you, on the children, then they have to make note of this and do something to redeem the situation.
But a lot of it is coming from our cultural background too, right? Because parents who are living here, who are raising their children here, they have a different conception. But
Right.
Parents who come from Pakistan and they live here abroad, then they expect the same as used to be done back home, that it was understood that,
Yes, you see, as I said,
they are with you, and
right.
that's it.
So this is a cultural thing. You are right about it, but you see, at times it's not always particularly cultural. It's moral as well. So we need to mark our boundaries. What is cultural and what is moral? Looking after the parents is a moral responsibility, I would say, and cultural responsibility is something in which we don't realize that undertaking that moral responsibility can be different for different societies. So culture can vary, but morality does not vary. So if this thing is kept in mind, I would say it might redeem the person. It might be satisfying for the person who is at the receiving end.
Okay, thank you.
So it seems that we have finished our. I can see Rafia Khwaja. Is this your hand up? Okay, it's no longer there. So okay. Just let me open your mic. Yes, please go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, Dr. Shehzad, many times I've heard in our country, but particularly, that the punishment for adultery is stoning to death. And this is a lot of ulema believe in this. So the Quran does not say this. So where are our ulema getting this from, or where are different
Well,
religious-minded people getting it from?
religious-minded people do draw this punishment from the practice of the Prophet and also from a narrative which says that the Prophet did stoning to death. So, as far as the Quran is concerned, it does not mention it explicitly. However, it does say in Surah Ma'idah that people who are guilty of a law and order situation, of disrupting law and order, of taking the law and order in their own hands, or doing heinous acts like, for example, raping women, or, for example, molesting children, for them the Quran has prescribed that they should be given exemplary death. And the exemplary death that the Quran describes can take various forms. One form of exemplary death for such cases is stoning to death. However, stoning to death in itself is not a Quranic punishment. The Quranic punishment is that when people disrupt and spread disorder and anarchy in the land, which is called fasad fil ard, then they can be dealt with severely. And the most severest of these punishments, the Quran says, is an yuqattalu, which means to kill them in a way which teaches other people a lesson. So rajam, or stoning to death, was one form of that punishment. There could be other forms as well. So,
but Dr. Shehzad, I was particularly asking for zina. I understand fasad on.
So you see, at times, adultery, adultery does become.
100 koras, or
you see, when adultery becomes prostitution, or, for example, when a person starts having these relationships as paramours in the society or in the family, it becomes a nuisance as well. So, in that case, it does not just become a case of adultery. It means that you are spreading and disrupting disorder in the society as well, and you're spreading this licentiousness or your own disruption in the society. So, that can be dealt with severely as well. But again, as I said, that this verse of Surah Ma'idah, it says that this is the extreme punishment. The least punishment for this is to extradite a person or to just banish him from the land. So, banishment or extradition from the land, or just making him leave the area or the country, is the least punishment as well, which is given here. So you need to understand that there is a severe punishment and there is a punishment which is least, or which is the least form of punishment for that particular crime. And I would advise you to look up some of the material that we have written. So that's a normal punishment for adultery, in which a person who is caught on this in this particular crime, for him is these 100 lashes. That is the punishment of fornication. That's a separate thing.
But even for that, I understand they have to be witnesses. You can't.
There have to be 4 eyewitnesses. Yes, you just cannot punish anyone without any of these. So that is why the Quran insists that you can't
accuse somebody without having
4 witnesses,
actual proof.
Right. So if a person does so, this is what the Quran says is called qazf, which means wrongly blaming someone of fornication, which in itself is a crime. And let me also tell this to you and point this out to you, that the Quran in fact wants us to hide this punishment. That if there is this crime, if there is a couple of instances, for example, in which a person has erred, maybe once or twice, and he's then the purport of the Quran is that instead of exposing him, because once you expose him and he gets this punishment, he is going to be humiliated for the rest of his life. So the Quran itself has said that it has fixed a very stringent, a very strict standard for proving that punishment, that there should be 4 eyewitnesses. Of course, this is something of a non-existent thing. It's very difficult that you do this in front of 4 people. So it has made this standard very harsh.
In Pakistan, it's constantly in the papers where a husband has some suspicious, sees, especially among the uneducated, he sees a wife talking to someone and he goes and kills her because he.
So you see, that is an absolutely baseless thing. This is, no one can take the law in his hands, even if he has seen his wife actually doing something wrong. The Prophet has actually once ticked off one of his companions who asked him that what should he do if he finds his wife in a compromising situation with a stranger. The Prophet admonished him and said that you just cannot even touch him. Let the law take its course. So this is what happens in third world countries like Pakistan is not something which Islam endorses at all. You just cannot take the law in your own hand. Punishment has to be done by the state, and that too in a way which has been prescribed by law. It just cannot be in a haphazard way, and it just cannot be venting out your fury because you think that your honor has been violated. Honor killings and these issues are a stigma on the face of Islam. I think they are more culture related, and they have more cultural, I would say, outlook than what Islam says, because there is absolutely no possibility of any such killing in Islam.
But Dr. Shehzad, shouldn't such people be given exemplary punishment?
They should.
So that
they
this
should be.
Killing should stop?
They should be given an exemplary punishment, of course. So that is how they should be. But what happens is, because of a wrong interpretation of the law of qisas or diyat, what happens is that once a father kills his daughter, what happens is that the rest of the family forgives him, because they think that if the heirs are forgiven, if the heirs forgive the person who kills the some other person of their own family, then this is what they call diyat. The whole murder issue is settled on diyat, which is of course blood money. And again, this is a misinterpretation of Islamic law, because Islamic law not only says that this blood money has to be given, it also says that the government has to be satisfied in this. So one of the parties to this crime is the society, and the representative of the society is the government itself. It's not just a crime against that family, it's a crime against the society. And in all such crimes, a state is a party in itself, and you just cannot let off a criminal unless the state is satisfied.
But if a husband does it, shouldn't he be punished?
Of course, as I said, he doesn't have this right. If he takes the law in his own, no one has the right to take the law in his or her own hands. No one can even touch the other person in any way. It has to be by law. If he sees something odd going on, if he sees something which is worth reporting, then it has to be reported. It has to be reported to society. It has to be reported to the police authorities. No one can take the law at all, because this would be the law of the jungle, and that is what has differentiated Islam from the age of Jahiliyyah. The age of Jahiliyyah was one in which people would take revenge for their own selves. The vendettas would be their own vendettas. State authorities, they come into play whenever a properly organized country that you're living in takes place. That is one of the reasons that the collective system is run by the state, that if there is to be some punishment, if there is to be some chastisement that is going to take place, then no one has this authority. Only the state has this authority.
But doesn't seem to be happening in Pakistan.
A lot of things don't happen in Pakistan. You see, it's not just this thing. There's so many things which are going wrong here. So we need to be, more considerate and think that we have to set right a lot of things.
And the Council of Sharia Ideology, the people sitting there, they don't seem to think that they can do anything.
Well, as I said, the Council of Islamic Ideology is basically a recommendatory body. It does not have any hold. So what it does, it makes recommendations to the Parliament. What has to be done is that the Parliament has to be more active. Instead of getting involved in so many things, like for example, economic issues, there are so many things which are like emergency to us. So these are issues in which the Parliament should get involved in. They should pass laws. They should make this point that all things which are being amiss are because they are happening because the Parliament is not behaving the way it should be. So I think the problem with us is that our parliamentarians are busy involved in petty issues and maybe some emergent issues, and they don't realize that there are long-term issues as well, and one of them is this enactment of laws.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem.
Okay. So viewers, it seems that we have now come to the end of our study circle, and hope to see you next week, inshallah. In fact, I do know that there is this this holiday the next week and the week before next, but week after next. But what I'll do is that although this webinar will not take place with this software, but I'll still be doing a session on Facebook Live. Though it might not be exactly at 9 p.m. Pakistan time, it might be slightly later, but this Facebook session will take place. However, this study circle session class, the way it is conducted on a software, will not be there for the participants. It will be a winter break for them. So thank you very much, and inshallah, hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Khuda Hafiz.